3 মিনিট বাকি আছে। কজন এসছে? এখনো লাইভ হোসনি তো? বলো।
লাইভে যাচ্ছে, লাইভে ইউটিউব লাইভে আছে,
ওকে,
আর ফেসবুক লাইভ আছে। এখন লাইভ হয়ে গেছে, মিউটে যাও। আমি এখন সবাইকে এক এক করে ঢোকাচ্ছি।
নমস্কার, আমি শৈবাল গিরি, মিউনিক জার্মানি থেকে আবার আপনাদের কাছে নিয়ে এসেছি জুন মাসের দি অনিতা ডায়ালগস। নেতাজির 125তম জন্মজয়ন্তীর উদ্দেশ্যে আমাদের এই যাত্রা শুরু হয়েছিল ফেব্রুয়ারি মাসের 8 তারিখে, এবং প্রতি মাসে আমরা এই অনিতা ডায়ালগসে ডক্টর অনিতা পাফের সঙ্গে নেতাজির জীবনের নানা ঘটনাবহুল মুহূর্ত আলোচনা করি সেই মাসের প্রসঙ্গে। এই প্রসঙ্গে আপনারা শুনেছেন হরিপুরা কংগ্রেসের কথা, এই প্রসঙ্গে আপনারা শুনেছেন সেই রোমহর্ষক সাবমেরিন যাত্রার কথা, এই প্রসঙ্গে আপনারা শুনেছেন গত মাসে রবীন্দ্র জয়ন্তী উপলক্ষে নেতাজি এবং রবীন্দ্রনাথের সম্পর্কের কথা। একই প্রসঙ্গে জুন মাস নেতাজির জীবনে একটি বিশেষ মাস নানা দিক দিয়ে। তবে সবচেয়ে বলার মতো ঘটনা হয়তো এমন একটি ঘটনা যে ঘটনার ওপর ভিত্তি করে নেতাজির জীবনের অনেকটা দিগদর্শন হয়েছিল, এবং যিনি এই ঘটনার দিগদর্শনের সঙ্গিনী ছিলেন, তার নাম এমিলি সেঙ্কেল। নেতাজি সুভাষচন্দ্র বোস এবং তার ভবিষ্যতের সহধর্মিনী এমিলি সেঙ্কেলকে নিয়েই আজকে আমাদের আলোচনা, এবং এই আলোচনায় আমরা তাদের সম্পর্ক, তাদের জীবন, সেই 1930-এর দশক, 1940-এর দশক এবং তারপরে এমিলি সেঙ্কেলের জীবনী, যার শেষ হয়েছিল 1996 সালে তার মৃত্যু দিয়ে, তারই নানা রকম তথ্য আমরা আজকে আলোচনা করব এমন তিনজনের সঙ্গে, যে তিনজন নেতাজির নিকটতম আত্মীয়ের থেকেও বড় কথা নেতাজির পরবর্তী জেনারেশন। তাই প্রতিবারের মতো আমার সঙ্গে যারা আসবেন তাদের পরিচয় করিয়ে দেওয়ার আগে I will have to switch to English and welcome you all to this edition of the Anita Dialogues in June. And like every time, the first person whom I would like to call upon in this very special edition. She is special in every edition because this event is held as a dialogue along with her. But perhaps this is the most special edition amongst the others, primarily because in this edition, we discuss about her parents and the first time that they met and how their relationship evolved. I must add a small genesis of this conversation, especially around Netaji and Emily Schenkel, is actually rooted in the first session of the Anita Dialogues in February, when out of curiosity, I had posed a question to her that everybody has written a book on Netaji. Why hasn't she attempted a book on her father? And the reply she gave me is actually has resulted in this conversation today, because she said perhaps she will never write a book on her father, but she will definitely write a book on her mother. And that is exactly what we are trying to do today in order to find out the life and the events in the life of her mother and the book rather that she is writing. So like every time, I think it is also my duty to speak less and let the honored guests take up from here. But it is also my duty that before I bring them into the audience, I just give you a small introduction about her. Anita Pfaff is the only daughter of Emilie Schenkel and Subash Chandra Bose. Anita was born in Vienna, Austria in 1942 and lived in Vienna with her mother and her maternal grandmother until the completion of her studies as a doctor of law and her wedding in 1965. Anita married Martin Pfaff, PhD, whom she had met during her first visit to India, and that was 1961, if you all remember. After their wedding, the couple moved to the USA. Anita became an assistant professor at Wayne State University in 1969. And in 1971, the couple moved to Germany, where they both joined the University of Augsburg as professors of economics. She retired in 2008. Incidentally, 2008 was the year when I formally met her at her residence in Stadtbergen, along with my father. Anita was a member of several federal commissions on various subjects of social policy, health economics, and demographic change, and member of the scientific advisory boards of various research institutions. She is the author of several books and numerous scientific papers on social policy and health economics. She was engaged in multiple politics as a member of the city council and deputy mayor of her own hometown, Stadtbergen. During the last few years, she has been engaged in social work, helping the integration of the refugees. Anita lives with her husband in southern Germany. They have 3 children, Peter Arun, Thomas Krishna, and Maya Karina, and 5 grandchildren. With that brief introduction, I welcome Dr. Anita Pfaff once again to this month's Anita Dialogues.
Jai Hind to all of you.
Good afternoon. Are you visible?
I presume so. At least I can see myself.
Okay. Yes, I can see you as I need to see you. No, I cannot.
Okay, I'll turn off the video once and then try to turn it on again.
Yes, please.
Can you see me now?
Yes.
Yes, I can see you. Thank you. Good afternoon. Nice to have you once again. And this is a very special month. And I am as curious as the rest of the audience. And I will be a very, very silent speaker in this edition, because I have 3 eminent personalities along with you who will be discussing a person or a pair of people very close to them in their real life as well. So my next guest in this show is Madhuri Bose. Madhuri is a great grandniece of Netaji, and she is the daughter and second child of Omiyanath Bose and Josna Bose. And she is the granddaughter of Saurabh and Bibhavati Bose, beloved elder brother and sister-in-law of Netaji. Madhuri first met her great-grandaunt Emilie in Vienna in 1978, which marked the beginning of a close and loving relationship until the passing away of Emilie in 1996. Madhuri was born and grew up in Kolkata, the principal home of the Bose family. After graduation and post-graduation studies in the University of Calcutta and Jadavpur University, Madhuri did further postgraduate studies and research, mainly in international human rights law, including the Graduate Institute of International Studies in Geneva, Switzerland. She had pursued her profession in Gillard. Madhuri is a founder trustee of the Bose Legacy Foundation UK, which provides scholarships to girl students to help them complete secondary school through partner community organizations in India. Last but not the least, Madhuri is the author of The Bose Brothers and Indian Independence, an insider's account, which was published by Sage Publications in 2016. Along with that brief introduction, it is my distinct privilege to welcome Dr. To welcome Madhuri Bose into our event. I would like to, yes, Madhuri, are you able to?
Yes. Can you see me now?
I think you will get a notification to switch on your video. Yes. Welcome and good afternoon.
Good afternoon and Jai Hind.
Thank you. Nice meeting you.
Same.
I am getting a message that Dr. Pfaff can't be seen on the FB stream. If that's the case, can we have people give me a message once again, please? Then I will perhaps try and see what to do. But in the meantime, I need to introduce my third guest. Okay, now it is okay. It seems. Now I introduce my third guest, another special guest for today, Maya Pfaff. She is the daughter of Anita and Martin Pfaff and the granddaughter of Emilie Schenkel and Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. Maya knew her Emilie very well as a very loving yet strict and quirky lady with a great sense of humor and fascinating past. That's a great way of describing a grandmother. They lived under the same roof during Emilie's final years of exile in Germany. Maya spent her childhood in Augsburg, Germany, and then ventured out into the world. During her travels, she discovered a great passion for the ocean and decided to become a marine biologist. She studied in Cape Town, South Africa, where she finally completed her PhD. She resides in Cape Town with her life partner, Alan Ellis. Maya has worked as a researcher, diver, lecturer, and government scientist in South Africa, and is the co-founder of the Limpet Environmental Education Project, which involves South African youth from disadvantaged backgrounds in the real marine science. She is the author of book chapters and research papers and has contributed to policy documents that support the conservation of coastal biodiversity through sustainable development. For Maya, life means traveling and exploring externally and internally. I have three eminent personalities from diverse background, a great economist, a very strong human rights activist, and a marine biologist, all tied by a bloodline called Netaji and Emilie Schenkel. I would keep my mouth shut from now onwards, and I will welcome Dr. Anita Pfaff to take us through the rest of the session. And I will come back again only if there are questions of relevance from the audience, which I feel is very important to address. Over to you, Dr. Pfaff, and looking forward to hear from all of you on this very interesting topic around your parents.
Jai Hind to all of you, and welcome for joining us on this occasion to talk about both my parents. My father, of course, has been the topic of the previous Anita Dialogues and will be the topic of the next few as well. My mother is probably less known to most people, and we picked this particular month to talk about her and the relationship of my parents, because June 28th was the day when they met in many, many years ago in 1934, when my father had come to Austria, which was my mother's home, Vienna, and he had come there for medical treatment. And since he was a rather restless person, he would not want to just be sick and be treated, but he also wanted to write a book about the Indian struggle at the same time. And for this purpose, he needed secretarial help. And my mother, who was a young woman at the time looking for a job and taking an English course with an Indian student, was recommended, and my father employed her. And to introduce the matter, my two co-fighters, Madhuri and Maya, and I prepared a PowerPoint presentation with which we want to sort of give you a pictorial impression of my mother and my father and their relationship. And let me start by mentioning one fact which may sound a bit funny to you. We will be referring to my mother and my father by their first name, or rather my mother by her nickname. My mother was christened Emilie, which was a somewhat fashionable name 100 odd years ago, but my mother never liked it very much. And from the very beginning, her parents called her Mimi, and all her friends called her Mimi, and she disliked Emilia sufficiently that she probably would come to haunt us if we were to refer to her as Emilia. So she will be Mimi for us. And of course, then we will not refer to my father as Netaji either, but we will refer to him as Subash. This is the two names we will also give them in our joint book on Emilia's or Mimi's life. So please don't feel too shocked that we call them by their first name in a sort of familiar way. Of course, in personal address, my mother was always Mama to me, and Omi, which is Granny to Maya, and Auntie to Madhuri. But for this purpose, they will be Mimi and Subash. Mimi and Subash had a fairly short time together, which of course was not that unusual in their generation, because many men in particular died young, because during wars, many soldiers die young, and some, even if they survive the war itself, are not very healthy or are prisoners of war and die young. So in any case, they suffered a fate which their generation maybe shared, particularly many women shared, that they were widowed rather early. So we have prepared a timeline for you to give you an impression how short their time together actually was. The whole period span, which covers the time when they knew each other, spanned the 28th of June, 1934, when they first met, when my mother came to introduce herself as a candidate for the secretarial job. And it ended with my father's death in 1945. But of course, during that period, they almost, well, they not only almost, but they had more times apart than together. So in 1934, they met, and during that half year left during that year, my father finished writing a book on India's independence struggle of the days, the Indian struggle. It was completed by end of November, when he got the news that his father was seriously ill and that he should return post haste, meaning by air, to hopefully see him before his demise. And returning by air at that time meant about 4 to 5 days, since flights were not as fast and did not take place during the night. Unfortunately, he reached Kolkata too late. His father had passed away about 2 days before. My father had left for Europe, as some of you may know, because he had fallen seriously ill during his imprisonment, and the British lords of the land were happy to see him go, and allowed him to leave the country to get medical treatment, of course, on his own terms and finances, and made it quite clear that they didn't want to have him back. So when he came back, he was put in under home arrest immediately. And surprisingly enough, he was allowed to leave the country again to continue his medical treatment in Europe only about a month later, month and a half later. By end of January, he returned to Vienna. And as I mentioned before, he was quite ill. And even though he had started treatment during the time when he wrote his book, he did not get that much better. And he realized that eventually he would have to undergo an operation. His main problem at that time was a severe gallbladder problem with frequent colics and so on. And at that time, of course, operations were a serious matter, and you tried to put them off if not necessary. But in 1935, he had to undergo the operation. And he spent the whole year in Europe, partly traveling to see politicians in different countries of Europe, partly writing. But in any case, it was quite clear that he was not welcome in India as far as the British were concerned. He continued up to the beginning of 1936, but then he wanted to get back to India, get back into politics. And before he left, he was told quite clearly that coming back to India, he would land himself in prison again, which in fact happened to be the case. So in any case, as far as Mimi and Subash were concerned, in March of 1936, they had to part company again. And that had been a relatively long time where they saw each other for the most part, and where their relationship became increasingly closer and more important to both of them. From 1936 March onwards, Netaji spent his time in prison at first, and then later on home interned in the foothills of the Himalayas near Darjeeling in his brother Sharat's vacation home. Even though that was a lovely place during many parts of most parts of the year, being imprisoned there was not only enjoyable. And reading the letters that he wrote to my mother during that period, at times he got quite bored and edgy and wanted to get away and read and do other things. In any case, they wrote each other practically every week at least. And eventually in late 1937, he had been released from prison and from home internment, and eventually he decided to get back to Austria to have another stay in a spa and improve his health, because during all that time he had not been back to his pre-jail days of more robust health. And during late 37 to 38, he and Mimi saw each other again, and he was working very, very productively, in fact, on an autobiography, which unfortunately he never finished, but the unfinished manuscript had later been published under the title of An Indian Pilgrim. In 1938, January, in fact, he returned to India and he was elected Congress president, and then stayed on during rather exciting times as Congress.
Diese Sitzung wird aufgenommen.
And later on, he was re-elected against the support of Mahatma Gandhi, and eventually, sorry, I'm having some problems with the technology. I hope you can still hear me. He had planned to come for another spell in Europe, but then, of course, another event took place which put an end to those plans. He was World War II started in Europe on September 1, 1939. He was put in prison again, and eventually, as far as the meeting of Subash and Mimi was concerned, they could only see each other again after a very adventurous escape from India on his part in 1941. In April, he reached Berlin and tried to get the help of the Axis powers, especially of Germany at the time, for India's struggle for independence. And he stayed there with sort of a half-hearted support on the part of the German and the Italian government till 1943, when eventually he realized that the developments of the war and the attitudes of the Nazi regime would not bring him enough support to make any headway in India's independence. And with the help of the Germans and the Japanese, he relocated from Germany to the Far East in 1943. And we have talked about this during the first of the Anita Dialogues in February. He took a perilous submarine journey. And he and Mimi did not meet in person after February 8, 1943. They had a little bit of communication during that time. He managed to send some few letters, I think partly by radiogram and partly by diplomatic bag. But unfortunately, the last three, which my mother, of course, had cherished, were confiscated by the British occupation after the end of World War II. And on August 18, 1945, a very tragic event took place. My father died as a consequence of a plane crash in what is now Taipei, in Taiwan. And my mother received that news on the radio, I think somewhere on the 21st or 22nd. And as you can imagine, was totally shocked and shattered by this news. So this is the timeline of their time together. My mother lived on for another almost 50 years and died in March of 1996, staying with us in Stadtbergen near Augsburg in Germany. Maya will now give you a background of her grandmother and her grandmother's family.
Namaskar. Can you hear me as I'm speaking through my mother's microphone?
Yes, Maya, we can hear you.
Okay, thank you. So who was this woman, Mimi Schenkel, who stole Netaji's heart? She was a Viennese lady, born to, who you can see in the pictures, a gentleman called Oskar Schenkel and a lady called also Emilie, originally Porsche, like the car, but then married Mr. Schenkel, and they were very much in love with each other from the onset. They had a very long engagement because Mr. Schenkel was very principled and he insisted on first securing a permanent position as a veterinary and before he would get married. he had this very strong need to be financially secured, as his father had passed away in his early life, and he endured hardship very early on and didn't want to bring that upon his family. So after this long engagement, the first child came about, and it was a very difficult birth, but nevertheless, little Mimi was a very lively and intelligent child. And you can see here a few pictures of her that sort of show her spirit. She's had a strong will and opinions, and from the early age was very much interested in philosophizing about all matters of life. And that was much encouraged by her father. You can see at the bottom right, there's a pile of books. Her father, as much as he was a veterinary, his true passion was writing and literature and philosophy. So he left us a treasure by writing very detailed and insightful journals. And we've now recently uncovered those journals and found all sorts of interesting facts about Mimi's and also her sisters, who's on one of the other pictures. She was 10 years younger, life when they were young, and the attitudes of their parents, which interested us much because it was a very unusual choice Mimi took to get married to a foreigner in a time when it wasn't that straightforward to pursue relationships, never mind those that cross cultural and even racial boundaries. But we'll get to that. So these are just some childhood pictures of Mimi. And then Mimi grew up to become this lady. There's a bit of a delay. You should see her now. So this is Mimi in the 1930s and 40s when she was in her 20s and 30s. And this is also the time when her and Subash met and had their few brief 8 years together. So again, she was, you can see maybe in the picture with the hat, she certainly had style and she very much enjoyed life. She was also had an opinion about everything, was happy to share that. So, and I think she was probably the kind of woman that would expect to be seen as an equal in a relationship. So this is Mimi. I think with this, I'll hand the talking stick back to my mother.
You had an overview which turned out a bit longer about the time frame we are talking about. And during the 1934, 35, 36, the first spell when Subash and Mimi met for longer periods of time, mainly his health, but also her health was not perfect, but he sort of kept on writing and working while he was trying to improve his health. And of course, one way was to use the rehabilitation features of the continental healthcare system, that is the spas, and two places particularly stick out. One was the spa of Karlsbad, which is now in Czechia, or Czech Republic, which is a traditional famous spa, especially for gallbladder trouble. And he went there before he had the operation, hoping that he might avoid it. And after his operation, he also went there. And he asked my mother to join him, and her parents agreed to do that, to let her do that, which was also not self-evident. And so he could continue his work, because at that time, of course, people did not have their own PC and wrote their own texts, but needed secretarial help to do that and organize other things. On the left-hand side, you see a picture of Subash and Mimi in Karlsbad in 1935, and In the middle, the picture with the, I don't know, is it a mountain goat or some animal on top, was also taken in Karlsbad, and the other two were taken in my father's favorite resort in Bad Gastein in Austria, which is a lovely place south of the city of Salzburg, in the midst of the mountains. And he not only loved to write and work and dig into things and use some of the spa facilities there, but he also thoroughly enjoyed taking long walks and not only keeping fit, but getting himself to be fit again for all sorts of tasks that he needed. And you see from the backdrop of the two Bad Gastein pictures that they spent different parts of the year there. The one with the dog was taken in 1936, and the other one with the snow behind in 1937, beginning of 1938. This was a time where they could both, actually their whole time together was always a time where there was a lot of work to be done. And at least in the spas, they could also do something for their health, and particularly Subash did that by exercising on long walks, and Mimi went a long part of the way, but then sometimes when it got too long, she turned back earlier, and the dog you see in the picture was getting rather confused when his pack, so to say, separated, and he wasn't quite sure, should he return back home or should he continue further. And I always say he was a lazy dog. He usually returned with Mimi after part of the way. Okay. One thing as a backdrop of the photos, you see a part of a letter, and in Bad Gastein during the stay in 1936, my parents found few occasions to write to each. Of course, when they were together, they didn't need to write to each other that much. But whenever they were apart, writing was always a risky thing, because as far as Subash was concerned in India, he could be certain that his mail would be censored. When he was imprisoned, it had the stamp censored and passed. And when he was not in prison, he also had to expect his mail to be read and maybe not passed on in any case. But in Bad Gastein, he found an occasion to write a personal letter, which definitely would not be censored. And we suspect that he had given it to her personally, not even sent it by mail from Bad Gastein to Vienna or anything. And you see an excerpt of this real love letter, which he wrote to her, which is in part reproduced on this slide. Okay. Jumping a few years ahead, Subash and Mimi met again in 1940. In 1940, my father was put in jail, and eventually going on hunger strike, he made sure that he would be released to home detention, because they were afraid that he might eventually fast until death. And when he was released to his home, he secretly began preparing for an escape to Europe, which again was an adventurous thing for him to do. and disguised as a Muslim from the Northwest. He, with the help of his nephew, he left his home in Kolkata at the time and escaped first to Afghanistan, Kabul. And there he tried to get in touch with the Soviet and with the Italian and the German embassies. And the Soviets were rather standoffish. You have, if you are familiar with history, keep in mind this was beginning of 41 by then. He had left Kolkata in January, and in beginning of 41, the Soviet Union was not yet actively involved in the Second World War. Only, well, almost exactly to this day, in fact, the 22nd of June, Germany attacked the Soviet Union and thereby drew the Soviet Union into the Second World War. But before that, the Soviet Union was not a formal ally of Britain yet. So it could have helped India, but on the other hand, they, for their own reasons, were not very keen to do that, but at least they were willing to allow Subash to pass through the Soviet Union. But eventually it was the Italian and the Germans who decided half-heartedly to help him. And so he passed through the Soviet Union to Berlin. And on April 3rd, my mother received a letter from him. You will be surprised to hear from me, because after all, during the Second World War, he could not, or they could not write to each other at all. And he asked her to come to Berlin, and he said, if I need a secretary, will you be able to work for me again? And by then, Mimi had taken on a job with the, by then Austria had been annexed by Germany, and it was part of Germany. And she was working for the German Postal and Telegraphic Service. And, but she went to Berlin, took leave, and was offered to work for him in Berlin. And the Foreign Office, which supported him in his efforts to some extent, wanted her to join the Foreign Office as an employee and then work for him. And my mother was afraid that working for the Foreign Office, they would sort of be able to exert pressure on her to spy on my father, which she didn't want. And therefore she said, no, I'm not giving up my job in Vienna. If you want me to work for Mr. Bose, you make sure that I get deputized from my office in Vienna. And eventually they agreed. And here you just have, we don't have too many pictures of them during that period. In fact, we have none where they are together. But they have two pictures of Subash and one of Mimi, which was taken during that period. And the Subhash's picture on the right was in so far always very important to my mother. It had been taken in Berlin, and this was the picture which she had always kept on her nightstand. That's why it was photographed here with the frame. And the left-hand picture was taken immediately after he arrived in Berlin, before he had shaven off his beard, because on the flight in disguise, he was traveling under an Italian alias, Orlando Sotta, and he also tried to disguise his looks. He grew a beard, which he did not wear before or after. And if you look at his glasses, these were the glasses that he used as a student in Cambridge about 20 years earlier. And many of you probably know that he had extremely bad eyesight, so he could not travel without glasses, but he also did not want to wear his current glasses, which would maybe have given him away more readily. So Orlando Mazzotta looks a bit different from Subash Bose, but this is the alias under which he lived in Berlin for actually to the end of his stay there in 1943. Here are just a few impressions of the next step. In 1942, my parents had gotten married according to Hindu rite. Having a civil wedding according to German law would have been exceedingly, well, embarrassing and dangerous and difficult. Embarrassing maybe for my father to sort of seek a favor and permit, because this was Nazi Germany with a strongly racist policy, and German citizens were not supposed to squander their precious German blood on foreigners. I'm sort of ad lib quoting the statements that some Germans who tried to marry Indians had to put up with. In fact, I see that Kiran Mukherjee is again joining us, and his parents went through that. His mother was German, his father was Indian, and when his mother applied for the permit to get married to her later husband, she was bawled out and insulted, and the permit was denied, and she was instructed not to tell any Indians why she would announced that she would not marry him. And then she was quite desperate, and she was a friend of my mother's and mentioned it to her. And then my mother said, well, I'm not Indian. Nobody told you not to tell it to other Germans. So nobody told me not to pass it on. And so she asked my father whether he could intervene. And in fact, he did. And the Mukherjees and another Indo-German couple could then get married. It would have been a bit embarrassing for my father to ask for a grace, so to say, for himself. And apart from that, if he had married my mother at that time in a civil wedding according to German law, my mother would have ended up in a very difficult situation. Number one, she would have lost her citizenship. Mrs. Mukherjee, for example, issued a sort of interim document by the Germans because she was no longer a German citizen after she married her husband. And keep in mind, India was a British colony at the time, and that would have made her an enemy alien in India, in Germany. As far as couples were concerned where the husband remained with them, that maybe was acceptable. My mother knew that she would eventually be alone because my father had planned for a long time to relocate to East Asia. And it would have ended her as an enemy alien in Germany alone. And you could not at all predict at the time how things would develop. Of course, some of the atrocities the Germans performed in the name of their crazy ideology was not really known in all detail, but you never could be sure what new crazy ideas might be coming out, and possibly as a either person without nationality or a British Indian subject. You don't know what might. Of course, one very definite problem would have arisen. My mother was a public employee. She would definitely have lost her job because public employees had to be German citizens. So this was the reason why they decided that it will be a Hindu marriage for them, which the Germans, at least officially, would not recognize, because that sort of saved her citizenship and her employment. End of November, my mother gave birth to me, and you see a few pictures of herself and myself as a little child at the time. So I turn over to Madhuri now. Oh yeah, one thing I have to repeat, I already mentioned it before. In 1945, after getting a few letters from the Far East from my father, my mother had the shocking news on the radio in the evening that my father had died in a plane crash. And my sister-in-law, Krishna Bose, who wrote a little book about my mother's life and about their relationship, mentions how her mother told her that when she heard the news, my grandmother and my aunt, who were there too, just stared at her, and she just walked out and went to my bed where I was already asleep. Madhuri?
Yes,
It's your turn.
yes. Can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you. So, yes, here you see the two brothers-in-law of Mimi. Something is actually blocking the photographs for me. Anyway, I can see that one is with Sharat and Bibhabati in 1948, and their children. You can see it's written there already. The standing is Rama, Mimi, and Chitra, and in front, sitting down, is Bibhabati and Sharat, with Shishir in the middle and Anita on his lap. The other photograph shows the youngest brother of Subhash, Shailesh, and his wife Bhakti, who met Mimi and Anita in 1955 in London. Right. In talking about Mimi and the Bose family, I thought I would share with you a little known fact. And it is about Mimi's missing letter. It's an important letter because one can say it is Mimi's personal testament. And this is a letter to Sharat. Just to give you a little bit of the background, about 6 months after the heart-rending news of Subhash's death in an air crash, and having heard nothing further to the contrary, Mimi decided to reach out to his elder brother, Sharat. Mimi was aware of the deep attachment between Subhash and Sharat, and also, before leaving on his submarine journey, Subhash had left behind a personal message for brother Sharat, which was to be sent to him in case the worst were to happen. Mimi was also not totally unknown to Sharat because two of his sons, Ashok and Amya, had met Mimi when they visited their uncle Subhash in Europe in the 1930s. And another nephew of Sharat, Aurobindo, had also come to see Mimi and Anita in Vienna in late 1947. The story of the missing letter of Mimi to Sharat is a very complex one. What I'd like to do is just share with you a few short excerpts. And it's obvious why this is such an important letter. And I called it Mimi's personal testament. So Mimi wrote to Sharath, addressing him as Dear Sir, you will be surprised to get a letter from a person unknown to you. I had for a long time hesitated till I decided to write to you in a matter regarding your family as well as mine. Your brother asked me when I was in Berlin if I would accept his proposal to marry him. Knowing him since years as a man of good character, and since there was a mutual understanding and we were very fond of each other, I agreed. The only difficulty was to get the necessary marriage permission from the German government. And it was very difficult for a German to get the permission to marry a foreigner. And since we both did not want to beg for a favor and wanted also to avoid making an affair of the whole matter, we decided to settle it between ourselves and got therefore married according to Hindu fashion in January 42. Anita has just talked about it, about the difficulties of foreigners marrying in Nazi Germany at the time. She further writes, on November 29, 1942, a daughter was born to us. The day before he left for the East, he wrote a letter to you, that is to Sharath, which he asked me to have photocopied. There were no photocopiers then, so it was meant to be a photograph of the letter, and sent to you in case anything should happen to him. This letter is written in Bengali, and he informed you about his marriage and the birth of his daughter. Now, this letter, which was written by Mimi on 12th March 1946, never reached Sharath. She had resent them twice in the same year. They also went missing. But then how did Mimi finally establish contact with Sharath? You must be thinking. Well, to use Sharath's own words here, I came to hear of the existence of Subhash's wife and child in Vienna from those who had become political enemies of my brother, namely Jawaharlal Nehru and Sardar Patel. Now, it's a long and complicated story, as I mentioned, and what finally happened was that Sharath decided to write directly to Mimi. Mimi wrote back, and the connection was finally established in the early months of 1948. It also did not take much time for Sharath to plan a visit to Vienna, and by the autumn of 1948, the family meeting took place, and Sharath and Vibhavati welcomed Mimi and Anita into the Bose family. If I may, I would like to quote a first-hand account of this meeting in Vienna, which has been written by my aunt Roma. It's a long piece, but I will just read out a very short section of it. I quote here now. It was quite late at night when the airport bus pulled up in front of the city terminal in the center of Vienna. As we alighted, we noticed an attractive lady wearing a black overcoat and hat waiting on the near empty platform. On seeing us, she rushed forward and said to my father, "It's he, only advanced in years." We realized that she was alluding to the striking similarity in looks between the two brothers Sharath, and Subhash. Then she opened her handbag and pulled out an envelope. She handed it to my father and said, "I have been waiting for this moment to hand this over to you personally." It was a handwritten letter in Bengali, which we have talked about, which Subhash had written to his brother, informing him about his marriage and the birth of his daughter. Mimi began to call my father Mezda, just like her husband used to, and immediately became part and parcel of the Bose family. Sharath and Bhiwabati really wanted Mimi and Anita to come to India, to live in India. But Sharath's sudden and unexpected death on 20 February 1950 brought those plans to an abrupt end. But the family bond between Mimi and the Bose family was firmly established, and members of the Bose family continued to visit Mimi and Anita, and they were received always with much warmth and affection. So here you can see successive generations of the Boses coming to Vienna to meet Mimi and Anita, though Anita had left for the US and then lived in Germany in Augsburg. But here are some members of the Bose family. I think there's with Shishir and Shubroto, the two sons of Sharath, with Krishna and Anita, of course, and the two children. And then there is Mimi with Brinda, Shubroto's daughter, and also another one with the daughter of Shishir. And I don't know if it's the left or the right side. Then there is a photograph I think it's in Augsburg, with my parents, Omyo and Josna. And there is a screen which is blocking my view of the other two photos. Anita, can you help me here? Can you, there is something blocking. I'm rid of it. And there is Mimi again with Shishi's son, Shugata. And the last one, I think it's, I'm guessing here because I can't see it fully. It's Mimi with...
It's Mimi with Madhuri and Chitra.
Right. It's all our faces blocking that photograph. The problem is I have a very small screen on my laptop. So I think I shall end there for now and hand it back to Anita.
We have been rather long, so I will shorten the rest of it. I got married in 1965, and my grandmother had passed away 4 years before that. So when I got married and moved to the United States with my new husband, my mother for the first time was completely alone. And however, she had lots of friends, really luckily, that sustained her. And in 1971, my husband and I, and by then 2 children, Peter and Thomas, moved back to Europe, to Germany. And from that then on, my mother spent quite a bit of time with us, with a growing family. So you have some impressions here on the left-hand side, our wedding photo with my husband and myself, and my mother. In the middle is our oldest son, Peter, with his son, Nico. with my mother, and the little baby on the right-hand side is that child of ours, Peter, as a baby. And on the bottom left-hand side, you see friends. That is, in fact, Mrs. Mukherjee and Kiran as a young chap, myself and my mother. And in the middle, my in-laws, Maya as a little girl, and my mother and my husband, and friends from Vienna who kept in touch with her for a long time. The Dalals, Mr. Dalal was Indian ambassador to Vienna, and Mrs. Mukherjee, who is quite aged now, but lives with her daughter, a namesake of mine, Anita, in Washington. And so family and friends sort of stepped into to relieve the loneliness. And here you have a few impressions of Mimi in old age. The bottom right-hand picture was of these here. The last one was taken about 3/4 of a year or so before she passed away. And the others somewhere over the years between the late 80s and the early 1990s. To sign off, and a few pictures of Mimi's biographers. Of course, you know that Madhuri, Maya, and myself are in the process of writing a book. And on the right-hand side, you find Krishna Bose, the wife of Shishir Bose, who is the third son of Sharad Bose. And she was not only a biographer of my mother insofar that she wrote a very nice little book about her and my father, and also Krishna's relationship with my mother. But the two of them were very, very engaged correspondents, and they kept writing long letters to each other. And even though they did not meet for all that long a time, if you put everything together, they had become great friends. And Krishna was certainly one person who also, or one of the persons, I should say, who kept her abreast on the Bose family news. And in our book, we want to give testimony to my mother's life, not only as spouse of Subash, but also as a person in her own right. And like many women of her generation, she was extremely independent, strong, and a loyal person who certainly lived through a very difficult phase of history. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I think fascinating 60 minutes. And at times I was thinking that we perhaps have time boxed ourselves too much. And it's a pity that we cannot cover more than what has been covered. But definitely, I think for the audience who must have joined in late, we are discussing Emilie Schenkel, wife of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, this month. And all of you who heard for the last 60 minutes actually heard about very many unknown details being unraveled for the first time through the narrative of three biographers who are writing the book on Emilie Schenkel, namely her daughter, Dr. Anita Pfaff, and her great niece, Madhuri Bose, and granddaughter, Maya Pfaff. So thank you for throwing light on so many unknown aspects of their relationship And I have only one curiosity. What is the name that you have kept for the book, or is it still a working title? What is the book that we would need to name in terms of buying it from the market?
Our provisional title is Subash's Emilia, and we hope she will not come and haunt us because we use her name Emilia, which she doesn't like. But if she's known at all, I think to the public she is known as Emilia. So
I saw that love letter in which he addresses her as darling. So didn't he call her as Mimi?
I'm not sure, but you see, it's not that unusual, as I don't have to tell you in Bengal, or at least it was not that unusual in that generation, that husband and wife did not call each other by their given names. So I'm not really quite sure.
So it is a third person singular number.
Because the censored letters, of course, are on Dear Miss Schenkel, or some of the German ones, Gnädiges Fräulein.
I thought he called her Bagini.
Yeah, he also called her Bagin, that's true.
Is it? Okay.
But I don't know whether this is the name he called her by or was just sort of a nickname.
Maybe when he was scared of her, he called her Bagini.
Wow. Well, why don't I come to Maya? Maya, I want to understand, you have been running this event quite efficiently in the background, and definitely I am expecting that you have a lot of research and all this stuff gone. But from your personal perspective, throw us some light on how you found your grandma. I'm sure you will write a lot in the book, but definitely let's hear as a closing comment. How did she influence you? What did you find? What are your early memories? Anything that you can share, perhaps?
Yes, as you mentioned in the introduction, I'm quite quirky. And we grew up in Germany, but she was Viennese, and you live in Germany. So Viennese people are quite funny, often. Great sense of humor, very typical sort of dark tint to the humor. She definitely had that. And she was very resolute. You know, she wouldn't take nonsense from anyone. And I really think anyone. She was her own person, and she lived by her own very strong principles and her own morals. And that I really admire, especially ladies in this generation often had to, subdue themselves to some powers that be. And I don't think she ever did. I think she was always standing in her own power. So I met her as that kind of person. And that inspired me very much.
Wonderful. And Madhuri, if I may ask the same question to you, because I'm sure you have already written on the Bose brothers part of it as a book. Now you are contributing on another book on another member of the family, with whom again you had quite a personal touch. And in fact, I was looking for that picture where you had taken with Mimi in a very young age that you were. So help us also have your perspective on your personal perspective on Mimi, maybe.
Yes, that photograph you've mentioned was taken in early 1978 when I first came to Vienna. I came to Vienna in March 1978 to stay with my brother Surya, who was already living and working in Vienna. And he was living almost next door to Mimi's apartment, which was on Bastiangasse, and Surya's was on Ferrogasse. And as you can imagine, we were meeting sort of every day. And we very soon became one family. I think what really struck me I had heard of Mimi, of course, from my father and mother. They had both met her before I came to Vienna. And but what really amazed me was how easily and naturally she could relate to so many different people, and especially youngsters. And maybe if I may say it in Bengali, and I think many among your audience are Bengali speaking, ভীষণ সহজে নিজের করে নিতে পারতেন. She could just make you feel part of her family. I think that's what I remember, and that's I'll always remember. She from the first day on, she made both. My brother Surya had already become part of her family, and when I joined in 78, she also just made me feel like another one of her family. She also scolded me from time to time, and when I used to get home a bit late, she would call me dushtu. She remembered a few words in Bengali too. And it's her affection and warmth which I remember most.
Thank you. I think it is their love and affection from each other that percolates from generation to generation, and that is how there is so much of closeness and bondage between yourselves as well in the larger context of the Bose generation and the family, for that matter. And your words actually reflect that stuff, and I'm sure that that the generations beyond this would also be carrying, to which I have a very personal privilege to witness. Anita ji mentioned about Nico and others, so we all see that love and affection and that bondage reflecting in the Bose bloodline, generation after generation. So I think it is time to call it close, unless I want to pass it on to Anita ji to make some of our closing comments on this topic before perhaps we call it a day today. Anything that you would want to say as the last special memories of your mother or parents, and anything special on your topic which you remember?
First of all, let me thank the audience today for taking the time to listen to us on the story of my parents' life together. I'm grateful for that interest. In fact, I always am grateful to many people who remember my father after this long time that he has not been around, who still give him affection and admiration and love. And thank you for also giving my mother that attention today. I think my parents both had a very difficult life. Of course, you might say my father also had a very exciting and dangerous life. And it certainly was not self-evident that they would respond to each other the way they did. My father sort of was single-minded, was of a single-mindedness of purpose. It was his country first, second, and third, and anything else had sort of to take second, third, fourth place after that. And so I think it was quite amazing that he got interested in a woman, in spite of this dedication to his country and his commitment to that. And of course, for my mother, it was also not easy. The women amongst you will probably appreciate that what she had to go through as a wife was certainly quite a bit of hardship too. I mean, many women at that time, of course, were separated from their husbands because they were drafted as soldiers and had to go and fight whether they wanted to or not, and many of them got killed. And of course, my father, in a way, was free to decide what he was doing. But my mother always stood by him loyally and accepted that. And I think this loyalty that she always showed to him, which also went far enough never to say a critical word about him, which is the interesting thing. In spite of all this hardship, it was quite remarkable. And the separation all the time, and then his untimely death, of course, was a very hard thing for her. Not only for her, but of course also for other members of his family, particularly my uncle Sharad was totally shattered when he received the news of his brother's death. In fact, he didn't want to accept it at all. He wrote to my mother once in one of the letters, he said, "I have a feeling, and it's nothing more than a feeling, that my brother is still alive, but it was nothing more than a feeling, and he just couldn't face the fact that his favorite brother was no longer." So I think my father was a lucky person insofar that there were so many people who loved him in a very exceptional way. And of course, his countrymen and countrywomen, even of today, are part and parcel to that. And thank you very much.
I can only say that the privilege is all ours. We, as an organization here in Germany, in Sampriti, we are privileged that we are able to take these stories to the world, especially on a continuous basis when your father's 125th anniversary is happening. So we don't celebrate it on a date or a day, but we believe that his life and legacy is much bigger than a single milestone in his life. And I think whatever you are saying is also getting reflected in a lot of audience reactions. And I want to actually pick up a few of those audience reactions. It is not a question, but these are reactions which I think is all the reason why we get inspired to make these initiatives. Anita Bera, she writes, "Listening with my uncle. He is one of the members of Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose 125th birth anniversary celebration India committee." So thank you, Anindita, for being there. And later we find that her uncle writes as well. "Thanks to all of you on my behalf. I am Komal Shai here, Anindita's uncle, and he is the gentleman who is a member of that committee for that matter." Then we have some other audience reactions, especially one that I found extremely interesting with respect to the point with respect to Dipanjan Sengupta. He has a direct comment for you. He says, "Anita ma'am, we want more episodes from your end. Please continue this." I think you need to give him some background and some future ground as well, because Dipanjan, I think you don't know a lot of stuff that she is doing every month. I'll let her speak on this. Please answer his question. Anita ma'am, we want more episodes from your end.
Well, you'll have to read the book. We have lots of episodes in there. In fact, too many maybe.
Yes, and on the other side, Dipanjan, we are actually having her every month. If you follow our Sampriti Facebook page, you will find the complete yearly calendar on which dates we are holding these Anita Dialogues. And for the rest of the audience, we also say that every month we pick up major milestones in Netaji's life and have a discourse around it. And that's how we had three eminent personalities discussing about Netaji and Emilie Schenkel in this episode. And while on this, it is my duty as well to let the audience know what happens in the next episode of Anita Dialogues. And that is what I will share before drawing curtains for today. So next month is the month of July, and it is in the month of July that we had a number of interesting events on the Eastern Theater of the world, where Netaji was, because as you know, he started the submarine journey and he reached the Madagascar coast, where he switched submarines and then reached the Far East. But what we will also like to discuss in July is the fact that the famous Ami Subash Bolchi, that announcement over Radio Berlin happened in July, and therefore 2 weeks from now we are doing it a bit earlier next month. So on 4th of July, we will be discussing Netaji in Europe. And there is a very interesting book written on that subject, in which Anita ji also has written the foreword of the book Netaji in Europe, written by Mr. Jan Koolman. And we will have Jan Koolman in our show in July. So I hope everyone of you like the show. Please send in your feedback, your inspirations, your comments to Netaji125 at sampritimunich.org. That is the email ID that we are specially using for this purpose. And we look forward to have you again next month. Thank you, everyone who joined this show. Thank you to my colleagues in Sampriti who has helped us in setting this up. And last but not the least, thank you, Anita ji, thank you, Madhuri ji, and thank you, Maya ji, on your insightful discourse that you so much of interesting aspects and added one more dimension in the chapter on Netaji that we are trying to cover as a part of his 125th birth anniversary journey. Namaskar and all the best.
Jai Hind.
Jai Hind.
Thank you.
Die Aufzeichnung wurde gestoppt.